She's become the latest symbol in the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Ahed Tamimi is currently under arrest and in the custody of the Israeli army after this incident. Tamimi's family says he hit the soldiers after they ransacked her home in the occupied West Bank and shot her teenage cousin in the face with a rubber-coated steel bullet at point-blank range. He had to be placed in a medically induced coma. The Israeli army says Tamimi's cousin was part of a group of stone-throwing protesters, some of whom apparently took refuge in the Tamimi home. It's not Ahed Tamimi's first time in the limelight. He's been a regular part of protests against the Israeli occupation for years. And now they've indicted her for this latest incident.
We can see that if the arrest would have been an arrest for just the sake of investigating what the footage shows, then Ahed could have gone home long ago. The behavior of the police and the security forces show that this is a punishment arrest in order to humiliate her and her family.
Just days earlier, dozens of Israeli soldiers were filmed dragging this Palestinian boy. Fawzi al-Junaidi was arrested last week, also during protests in the West Bank. But he denied being part of them and said he was just going out to get groceries. Junaidi was later released without charge. He said he was beaten up during his detention. Israeli security forces are coming down hard on the protests that broke out after US President Donald Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. That decision enraged Palestinians, who have always claimed East Jerusalem as their own, and brought hundreds of young people like Tamimi out on the streets in the face of the Israeli military. A majority of states at the UN recently condemned the US decision on Jerusalem. That appears to have encouraged the protesters. The question now is whether the arrest of this high-profile Palestinian teen will embolden them even further. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, I'm joined now by Ahed Tamimi's lawyer, Gaby Lasky. She's a human rights attorney in Tel Aviv. I thank you very much for joining us. So we're seeing here 12 charges against Ahed Tamimi. She slapped and kicked soldiers, and now she's in trouble. Were her actions regrettable?
When we're dealing with a military case regarding resisting the occupation, I don't know if exactly the right question is if her actions are regretful. We can say that if someone makes a criminal offense, they have to indict them, but of course they have to take into consideration everything that is around it. As we're saying, the occupation and the fact that the soldiers were in her backyard.
Right, yeah, just
and
trying
that her cousin was shot with a rubber bullet just...
Certainly. I'll tell you what I'm trying to distinguish here. Are you arguing in her defense that what she did might have been wrong and regrettable, but it was provoked and had a context, which is military occupation, or that her actions were entirely justified as legitimate resistance against occupation?
Well, first of all, it's a little bit early to decide what kind of arguments we're going to present to court, since we haven't got the evidence that was collected by the police and the military after Ahed was arrested. I have to say that some of her charges are as old as April 2016, and at that time nobody thought that her actions were any kind of criminal in any way. She wasn't arrested, she wasn't questioned, she wasn't indicted from them, and only after the video came out and she was arrested, then suddenly they start to look into a 15-year-old girl at that time, girl Facebook, and to see what kind of things that they can find in her past. So we have to get all the evidence, and then we will decide what kind of defense we will present in court. Of course, it will have elements of the fact that she was born into occupation, and it is rightful to resist occupation with your bare hands. And we will also bring to the court the fact that settlers commit the same kind of offenses, and in most cases they're not detained or arrested, and of course they are not sent to prison for a long period of time because of those actions.
My next question is about your trust in the system. Do you believe, as her lawyer, that she will get a fair trial in this military court?
Well, as you pointed out, it is a military court, and it's the court of the occupier. So from its sense, mostly the task of this court, as in any other organ of the military in occupation, is to perpetuate occupation. We're not really talking about a court of justice, but we're talking about a military court of occupation, where all the sides are, the judges are soldiers, as same as a prosecution, etc. So with taking into consideration that, we will still fight for Ahed's liberty.
And of course, you are closer to the facts than I am. All I have is what I'm working off based on Haaretz and Jerusalem Post and Reuters and so on, and all these articles that I'm reading. And it seems the prosecutors have arrested her mother for incitement, and it includes her mother, Nariman, posting a video on Facebook of Ahed urging others to protest against Israel, which includes stabbing attacks and suicide bombings. Now, they're calling that incitement, right? Do you accept that this will invariably be brought up and that it might well strengthen their case against Ahed?
Well, it will be brought up. Regretfully, as in other cases that I am dealing with now, the fact that the translation of what I had said in Arabic is not what they are presenting in the indictment, that is something that we will show during the trial. And it is not the first time that even in a military court where every person that is brought here is an Arab speaker, the translations are not good enough in order to present really what was said in the video. So they will, since it's in the indictment, they will try to show it. But of course, we're working on a professional translation to show that the things that are written there were not said in the way that they were presented.
Very finally, if you lose, do you expect
and actually
her...
don't represent incitement at all.
Certainly. Very finally, if you lose, do you expect her to spend a lot of time in jail?
Well, that was the point, actually, of trying to find other offenses for Ahed, because actually we were able to release Noor, Ahed's cousin, from a request of the prosecution to keep her in detention until the end of her trial. And she's charged only with what you can see in the video. So it means that even in the court's eyes, it is possible to release someone because of the actions of the video. So since the prosecution probably was aware of that, they tried to find other charges in order to make her case more hard and so if in the sense that if she's found guilty, the prosecution wants to keep her in detention for as long as possible.
Okay, well, Gaby, we'll be following the news very closely, and we thank you very much for talking to us. Gaby Lasky, the Tamimi family lawyer, joining us there. Thanks a lot. Let's bring in two new guests now to debate the topic. We've got Ben White in London. He's an author of several books about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And Jeffrey Alderman. He's a professor of Jewish history and politics at the University of Buckingham. I thank you both for joining us. Jeffrey Alderman, if I can begin with you first, does Israel really need to be defending itself against the slaps of a 16-year-old?
You know, in London, from where I'm speaking, we have soldiers guarding certain buildings. And if a 16-year-old child were to go up to one of these soldiers and give the soldier a slap and a push and a shove, that child would be arrested and brought up before a court. So what happened in Nebi Salah, the village in question, is no different from what would happen in London.
Ben White, the same thing would have happened in London.
Well, to say the situation is no different is a bit ridiculous, really, because Nabi Salah is in the West Bank, which is under Israeli military occupation. It has been for half a century. Ahed Tamimi has only ever known foreign military rule from the Israeli occupational authorities, as has her father, also only known Israeli military rule. That's an Israeli military occupation that has facilitated the colonization of Palestinian land, including the land of the Nabi Salah community as well. Therefore, sort of to try and make an analogy with London doesn't really make sense. Of course, if a child was arrested in London for slapping a policeman, for example, that child would be subject to a civilian legal proceedings, whereas Ahed Tamimi, as are other Palestinian children and Palestinian adults, are subject to Israeli military courts, a court system that has been slammed by Palestinian, Israeli, and international human rights groups for its conviction rate, which one study a few years ago put it above 99%.
Okay, so Jeffrey Alderman, clearly London is not the West Bank. And if we just factor in the additional context that here's a girl who's legally still a kid, just a week before they shot her cousin in the face and put him in a coma, shouldn't the military court be taking all of this context into account before dealing with her? It's a very different situation to compare it to an unprovoked attack in a city that's not under military occupation.
Oh, I think the military court should take all that into account, and should also take into account the conduct of this child's parents. This child should be in school, not out on the streets slapping Israeli soldiers.
Ben White, she should be in school.
I mean, actually, the soldiers were on her property. The Israeli occupation forces, as they do across the West Bank, violently enter Palestinian villages, Palestinian homes, and Palestinian families from young to old face, from the moment they're born, the reality of the Israeli military violently entering and raiding their communities, shooting their relatives, as you mentioned in the case of the Tamimi family. And in the case of Ahed Tamimi, I mean, actually, although it's gained, notoriety and the video attracted a lot of views, most of the core aspects of this case are depressingly routine. The fact that the Israeli forces conduct arrest raids in the middle of the night, the fact that Israeli forces snatch Palestinian children out of their bed and subject them to military prosecutions. Israel is unique in the world, in fact, in systematically prosecuting children in military courts, hundreds of them every single year.
Jeffrey Alderman?
I think we have to put some historical context into this. The Israeli military authorities in Judea and Samaria are carrying out duties in succession to the British, who were the mandatory authorities. They're not carrying out their duties in succession to the Jordanians, who were indeed in illegal occupation of this area. I'm genuinely curious as to why we never had all these incidents of violence when, from 1948 to 1967, as Mr. White will know, the Jordanians were in illegal occupation of this area.
But Mr. Alderman, do you want us to host a debate about what Jordanian troops did between 48 and 67? I mean, we're living in the first week of 2018. We're discussing this particular issue. Your historical parameters are accepted. Sure, the Jordanians occupied it during that time. But we're talking about it now under international law. The West Bank, under occupation, under Israeli occupation. And what we're saying is that here's a young girl who slapped and kicked some soldiers. Again, we go to the core element of the question. Is the treatment of the girl justified?
I think the treatment is justified insofar as she's being brought before a military court. But I do agree that the military court, in coming to whatever judgment it comes to, should take all factors of the situation into account and apply mercy wherever mercy is deemed appropriate.
Ben White, this is about a young girl, but it's also about more than just a young girl. Many people see her as a symbol. Tell me why.
Yeah, well, I think we should at least problematize the idea of her as a symbol. Just quickly, I mean, I think one of the reasons why one of the reasons why her case has become famous, and particularly from the Israeli point of view, yes, it's because her slap of the soldier represented, from the Israeli point of view, defiance and a lack of what they would assume is due deference from the part of the colonized in front of the occupation army. But there's also a kind of racialized paradigm there. Again, from the Israeli point of view, Jewish Israelis are perceived of as kind of Western, quote unquote, and European, and the Palestinians are part of the sort of Oriental other, again, quote unquote. And that's why the Israelis have talked a lot about Ahed Tamimi's looks, for example. So I think we have to be aware of that fact, and including in terms of how that case has got coverage in the West. But in terms of what it symbolizes more broadly speaking, as I mentioned earlier, this is unfortunately all too common. There are thousands of Palestinians in Israeli detention. Many of those Palestinians have been prosecuted in military courts with a more than 99% conviction rate. And of course, let's remember that the Palestinians who are prosecuted in military courts live alongside Israeli citizens, Jewish Israeli settlers, who live, often work, inside the pre-67 line. Ahed Tamimi's family's quote-unquote neighbors, the Israeli settlers who live in Halamish next to Nabi Salah, they're Israeli citizens, and they are tried in civilian courts.
Right.
So, among other things, Ahed Tamimi's case is also a microcosm of the situation of apartheid that the Palestinians experience.
And you see it as a microcosm, and you see the occupation as the contextual background, and a lot of the, I guess what you would call dehumanization, right, of what's going on. We saw Jeffrey Alderman, he was criticizing her family. Ben, don't you agree that her family maybe could do a little better than what her mother has done by posting videos on Facebook in which prosecutors call this incitement, in which young Ahed is urging others to protest against Israel with things like stabbing attacks and suicide bombings? Would you agree that that's not very nice parenting?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the Israeli case is made that any time that someone like an individual like Tamimi or someone else achieves particular gets individual attention, that there's something afoot, that in this case she's something akin to a child actor or an agent provocateur, or her family are sort of quote unquote abusing her by not raising her correctly. And apart from a lot of racism that goes into this, there's a basic assumption that nothing actually untoward or wrong is happening in the occupied Palestinian territories, that there isn't really an occupation at all for some people, that, as we heard from your other guests, the West Bank is so-called Judea and Samaria, part of the quote-unquote liberated territories after 67. So if you don't share the paradigm of military occupation, if you don't share the paradigm based on the reality on the ground, the brutal reality on the ground, then you're obviously ill-equipped to actually understand or interpret the defiance, anger, and agency of Palestinians on the ground when they resist.
Talking about the agency of the Palestinians on the ground, Jeffrey Alderman, we've seen Israel very legitimately over the years say, hey, we don't want bombings. We don't want Palestinians to attack us with guns. They say we don't want Palestinians to attack us with stones. But now we're seeing a young girl going to military court for slapping someone. So what does that say? Does that say that the only way to be a good Palestinian is to accept the occupation and just lie down because you can't even slap somebody when you want to fight back?
If you're asking me to give some advice to the Palestinians, it is to face reality that ethnic Jews have a right to dwell on what you call the West Bank, and they must accept this reality. If they do not accept this reality, they must accept the unpleasant consequences. That's the fact.
But why don't Palestinians just abide by international law, which says that the West Bank should go to them in a future state because it's currently militarily occupied? Isn't international law a better reference point than the subjective views of the Israeli settlers?
Excuse me, what international law are we talking about? Under international law, ethnic Jews have a right to dwell in Judea and Samaria. That is international law, and the Palestinians have to accept that.
Under international law, the settlements in the West Bank are legal, in your opinion?
They are. Many of them, of course, were approved by the British mandatory authorities between roughly 1921 and let's say 1939. They were actually approved by the mandatory power, Britain, and that was approved in turn by the then international body, the League of Nations. So you're not going to tell me that these Jewish settlements are illegal. They were actually permitted by the mandatory authorities.
No, and I appreciate your knowledge of the 1920s and the League of Nations. How about we fast forward to the United Nations and UN Resolution 242 and beyond, and the fact that the United Nations, you can't tell me the United Nations doesn't see the West Bank as militarily occupied, because then otherwise we're coming at this conversation from very different universes, aren't we?
We are, I think. Resolution 242 is quite clear that as part of an overall peace settlement, Israeli armed forces, I'll repeat that, Israeli armed forces must withdraw from occupied territories. Let's not worry for a moment whether it's all the occupied territories or not. It doesn't say anything about Israelis withdrawing, and it certainly doesn't say anything about Jews having to withdraw. Incidentally, Resolution 2334. Yes, please do.
Okay, come in, Ben.
Yeah, sorry. No, sorry. I mean, I think we need some clarity after this rather sort of selective historical meandering. I mean, the international legal position on settlements, Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, is really pretty categorical. And I'm not going to list all the different UN resolutions or the position of the International Criminal Court in The Hague and so forth. I mean, it's suffice to note that in the early months of Israel's military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip in 1967, an Israeli official, a legal advisor to the Israeli Foreign Ministry, himself told the government that to settle the occupied territories with civilians, to colonize this land, would be in contravention of international law. The international legal position is really clear. And I think we also need some clarity with respect to the other guests' attempts to talk about how, quote-unquote, ethnic Jews have the right to live in the West Bank. It's actually...
Yes, they do.
It's actually really not the point. But this is not the point. This is to completely change the goalposts. Israel, the state, does not have the right under international law to settle the occupied territories, and Israel does also not have the right, as no country has the right, to maintain a regime of apartheid, colonization, and segregation, as is the current reality in the occupied Palestinian territories. That is a reality that's been going on for decades, where Palestinians and Jewish Israeli settlers have got different rights, ironically, based on their ethnicity and national origin. So the reality today is that of an Israeli apartheid, and the point isn't whether an ethnic Jew, quote-unquote, can live or not in the West Bank. The point is whether Jewish settlers can enjoy privileges that the Palestinians don't. And that is not a right under international or under most people's sense of basic morality.
Jeffrey Alderman, as we bring this all the way back to the beginning, because I know we've broadened this out a lot, I want to bring it back to the young girl, the 16-year-old. Do you absolutely believe she'll get a fair trial in the military court?
I think she will get a fair trial. But I would urge on the military court, insofar as my opinion is worth anything, that they show mercy to a girl who has been, I think, exploited for international media purposes. It's really very sad.
Ben White, final word in less than 30 seconds, please, because I have to move on after this.
Well, I mean, based on the other guest's faith in the military courts, and I'm sure that he would want Israeli settlers to be also judged in the military courts rather than the civilian courts. But I think we have to remember that this is one person. Unfortunately, it may well be the case that she's going to spend months or maybe years behind bars, as thousands of other Palestinians have been and are doing. And it really, in terms of how we're looking at it from the outside, we should use it as an opportunity to educate ourselves about the reality of oppression, incarceration, and colonization that the Palestinians are experiencing on a day-to-day reality.
Ben White and Jeffrey Alderman, I thank you both for taking the time to join us here on the Newsmakers. Thanks again.